Hey, great. Good afternoon, everyone. So happy to have all of you here. My name is Jennifer Prestold. I am Deputy Director at the Advocates for Human Rights, and I direct our International Justice Program. We're really happy to have so many of you involved with helping us with our international advocacy. This is a core and very important piece of our work. And so especially happy to have some of our associates involved with helping us with writing stakeholder reports for the Universal Periodic Review. So that's what we'll be talking about today. I'm joined by my colleagues, Nathan Madsen, Veronica Cadavid Gonzalez, and Katia Galambos. We've divided this up amongst the different speakers. So I will go ahead and get started, and then I'll have people introduce themselves as they take over their parts. So today what we're going to do is we're going to give you a quick overview of what the Universal Periodic Review, or UPR, is. We'll talk a little bit about death penalty issues. We'll be focusing this summer on stakeholder reports around the death penalty for the most part. We've prepared a template, so we'll walk you through the template, and then sort of give some tips and best practices in writing what's called a stakeholder report as a non-governmental organization. We are a stakeholder in the review process, and then some more specific information about recommendations under the UPR process. So a little bit about the Advocates for Human Rights. This is the 40th year of the Advocates for Human Rights. We're an international organization, nonprofit, based in Minneapolis, Minnesota, but we do work locally, nationally, and internationally on a variety of international human rights issues. Our goal is to implement international human rights standards in order to promote civil society and reinforce the rule of law. And so this is a very practical application of that work. The Advocates has something that's called special consultative status. If we can go to the next slide. What this is, it's a status within the United Nations system that allows us to participate in the human rights mechanisms at the UN. This is a photo from the UN Palais des Nations in Geneva, of the security gate of NGOs coming in to get their badges to work at the UN human rights mechanisms, including the Human Rights Council. And during the pandemic, a lot of things moved to be remote. Now they're back in person, but we have the benefit of being able to participate both remotely and in person. This is a really important part of our work because we've found that using the international system and using an international human rights framework can be very effective in changing laws and making other changes on the local level in countries around the world. And we're actually seeing with the death penalty that has been particularly true. The Advocates works in collaboration with partner human rights defenders in other countries when we're working outside of the US. And we have a long-standing partnership with the World Coalition Against the Death Penalty. We're actually on the steering committee of the World Coalition, and the World Coalition has members in more than 100 countries, I think more than 120 countries around the world. So we've been doing a lot of international advocacy, both written and in person and remote advocacy to try to change that. And the abolition of the death penalty is actually a bright spot in the human rights world right now, which is kind of strange to think about, but a lot of countries are abolishing the death penalty. So there have been, I think approximately 4 in the last year and a half. So it's a really positive trend and a really good time to be involved in this work. So I'll give you just a little bit of a background about what the Universal Periodic Review, or UPR, process is. So the UPR process is actually one of the newest human rights mechanisms. It is what's called a charter-based mechanism, which means that the Human Rights Council, so the UPR happens at the UN Human Rights Council, and the Human Rights Council derives its power from the UN Charter. So that means that the Universal Periodic Review, which is a review that every member of the United Nations goes through, it applies to everyone or every country that is a member of the United Nations. And that's important to understand because it also includes every human right And if you have done any of this work before, you will know that the sort of corollary body of mechanisms is treaty-based. And so for those countries have to sign and ratify the treaties. Most of the human rights work that happens at the UN happens in Geneva. And so the Human Rights Council is based in Geneva at the Palais des Nations. There's actually a huge renovation project, and they're getting kicked out of their typical room for a short term as the renovation happens. Next slide. So as I said, the UPR process, every UN member state is reviewed approximately every 5 years. It's on a regular schedule. There are three sessions a year with about 16 countries that are reviewed at each of those sessions. But this is a political space. This is a peer review process. And so the term that's used is that a country or a state with a capital S goes before its peer bodies or its peers in the Human Rights Council for an interactive dialogue. So it is a very diplomatic process. It has the advantage of all human rights issues being included, and that can be really helpful if a country has a very poor treaty ratification record. It's a state-driven process. So in the actual space in room 20, which is the photo on the left, it's the diplomats who are making recommendations to the other diplomats in the country that's under review. And a country can either accept the recommendations or they can note. And again, this is diplomatic speech. So it's a nice way of saying reject. But that's ultimately our goal, is to influence these members of the Human Rights Council who represent their countries to make strong recommendations. So here's a graphic that just sort of shows the breakdown of the 5-year cycle. There is a preparation of the information for review. The interactive dialogue is when so that's where we are now. We're in this first phase of preparing information and submitting it to the council to be considered as part of the review. The interactive dialogue, it happens usually in person, and so the written report is submitted. Usually it's about 6 months before the interactive dialogue. The adoption of the report is when the country will come back and say what recommendations they have accepted and what they have noted. And then, the biggest chunk of time in the UPR reporting cycle is the implementation of the recommendations. But it is a cycle. And so what we will be looking at is how countries have implemented the recommendations that they agreed to accept the last time around. So just to put a little bit more detail into this, in the preparation of information for review stage that we are in right now, the NGO or non-governmental organization stakeholders, as well as national human rights institutions, submit written reports. The government compiles a national report, sort of, telling, and usually these are the government reports are accentuating the positive, because they're going before their peers in the international community and they want to look good. The UN agency, the Office of the High Commissioner for Human Rights, does a summary of the stakeholder reports and compiles information from other UN agencies, whether that's the UN High Commissioner for Refugees or UNICEF, UN Women, and so forth. At the interactive dialogue stage, I'll just kind of quickly go through this. So the government presents its report, and then states make recommendations. And then there's a lot of work that happens kind of behind the scenes in terms of drafting the report and recommendations for the adoption of the report. So that's public. The Human Rights Council will publicly consider and then adopt it's kind of like the formal record of the review. And then some of the things that happened during the implementation phase, which again is the longest phase, is that for us as a non-governmental organization, we can, push governments, who have adopted recommendations to say, look, you adopted, you said you would do this, now you need to do that. So a lot of work happens in partnership with our partners on the ground to push for that. So we document and monitor how governments are doing and implementing those accepted recommendations, and then the whole thing starts again. So there are a number of opportunities that the advocates engages in, and a lot of this is done in partnership with our human rights defender partners on the ground, and so they will often work on the ground to consult with the government, give input to the government as they prepare the national report. What we're doing right now is submitting written stakeholder reports on the human rights issues. And then the next phase for us as an NGO is really to start on a lobbying process. So we have both an electronic lobbying process through email, and then do both Zoom meetings, and if happen to be in Geneva, we do in-person meeting with these Human Rights Council delegates. You can watch the review. It is live on the UN Web TV. We found some of our partners have been very effective in holding a press conference around and doing media events around that event. The advocates will often host side events. Those are events that are at the side of the session. So we've done both in person and remote, but it's another opportunity to draw. So there are a lot of opportunities for us to draw awareness around the issues that we raise in our written reports. So we try to maximize every bit of that. And then I think in the interest of time, I'll just probably skip over to the last bit, which is again, just to sort of sum up the major things that we're doing at this phase is, and that you're helping us with, is draft these stakeholder reports that will then go into they'll be standalone, but also in a summary report that all the Human Rights Council delegates have access to, and then we'll also use that for both electronic and in-person advocacy with Human Rights Council delegates. And so this photo is from last September, which was our first time back in Geneva since before the pandemic. And we're meeting with I don't remember which country this, well, actually you can't see it. These are our partners. We have a partner from Pakistan, from Indonesia, and from Ghana who are with us. But just to give you a sense of when we say lobbying, we actually are doing sit-down meetings to discuss the major human rights issues that we'll be working on right now in terms of gathering and collating into a report, and then also making recommendations.
Thanks, Jennifer. My name is Nathan Madsen. I am a staff attorney with the International Justice Program at the Advocates for Human Rights. I'm going to start us off talking about death penalty issues, because this is the main area of focus that your stakeholder reports are going to be covering, is the death penalty. So these are just some of the common issues that we come across when it comes to the death penalty. You may not find that all of these are applicable in the particular country that you are researching and writing about. You may find that there are other issues that are intimately tied to the death penalty that you want to cover. But we just want to go over really quickly some of the common issues so that you understand a little bit more about what does constitute death penalty activism or reporting on the death penalty and what does not. So one of the major issues that we come across when it comes to writing stakeholder reports on the death penalty is death eligible crimes. So some countries have the death penalty as an available punishment for many, many different crimes. But international human rights law specifically says that only the most serious crimes, and that is in quotation marks, are eligible for can garner the death penalty. if a country retains the death penalty. And what that means is that there needs to be a death involved. So there does need to be someone who actually dies, and that death needs to be intentional. So there are many different countries that have the death penalty for drug-related crimes or for consensual same-sex sexual activity. Those are not considered most serious crimes and thus violate international human rights law. And so we want to frame it in that terminology that they are not under the most serious crimes. The mandatory death penalty is also a very big consideration. And one of the reasons why the mandatory death penalty is so problematic is because it doesn't take into account any of the evidence or any of the situations surrounding a potential death-eligible crime. And we consider that to be an arbitrary use of the death penalty, which is a violation of international human rights law. So there should always be the ability for a judge to choose whether or not to use the death penalty. And when it is mandatory, that is a violation of human rights law. Juvenile offenders is also a very common issue within death penalty. That means that anybody who is under the age of 18 at the time that the crime was committed being sentenced to death. And then there's also many different issues when it comes to people with psycho and social disabilities. The important thing to remember here is not that individuals who have psychosocial disabilities cannot be executed, but it is that there is specific context that needs to be taken into account during the adjudication of guilt, as well as the adjudication of punishment stage. And so oftentimes those issues are not taken into account when somebody is during trial. Other sort of issues that we want to highlight are fair trial issues. I'm not going to go through everything in the subheadings because we will be sending this PowerPoint out to you, but fair trial issues are a very important thing to pay attention to, especially when they apply to trials that result in a sentence of death. Detention conditions, specifically for people who are on death row or are under sentence of death. However, we do sometimes cover detention conditions more broadly because we know that people who are under sentence of death are oftentimes under similar detention conditions. A right to appeal. Anybody who has been sentenced to death should have the right to appeal, and denying a right to appeal is a violation of human rights law. Execution methods need to be humane. Oftentimes we see that they are not humane, and so talking about execution methods is another area that we talk about a lot. And then gender in the death penalty is a particularly important area that we try to highlight in as many reports as we can as possible. And in particular, we're interested in the ways in which women experience the death penalty. You may not find that any information about whether or not women are under sentence of death in the country that you're researching, but there's always the possibility that if the death penalty is an eligible punishment, that women could be sentenced to death. And it's important that judges are aware of particular gender sensitivities when it comes to crimes that lead to the death penalty, because we oftentimes find that women who are sentenced to death overwhelmingly are sentenced to death for murder of a family member, and oftentimes that is after or in the process of domestic violence. And so it's important to remember that there is oftentimes defenses that women could raise when it comes to the death penalty, and sometimes they're not able to do so in the legal system. Discrimination is also a major factor when it comes to death penalty. We see a lot of migrant and domestic workers who are sentenced to death overwhelmingly in certain countries, as well as ethnic, linguistic, or religious minorities, or members of the LGBTIQ+ community. And lastly, human rights defenders oftentimes are targeted by governments for defending or advocating for the abolition of the death penalty. And we do have a video. Here's a screenshot from that video that I will be sending out as well. It's an hour long, but it dives much more deeply into these issues. So if you have the time, I would recommend watching it. It does provide a good overview of a lot of the death penalty issues that we just quickly went through in the interest of time. So the next thing that I'm going to be talking about is our template. We have a particular template when it comes to writing a stakeholder report. This is what the template looks like, and you will be receiving that with other information on your particular country when it comes to writing the stakeholder report. We do ask you to follow this template very closely because this is simply the approved template when it comes to submitting these stakeholder reports. This is the front page. It's going to be, or the cover page, it's going to be relatively untouched by you. We will fill in the state party, the session of the working group of the Universal Periodic Review, etc. What you're really going to be looking for is later on in the template itself. And that is for these themes. And as you see here, for example, there's D22, extrajudicial, summary, or arbitrary executions. And D23, death penalty, D25, prohibition of torture and cruel, inhumane, or degrading treatment. So the entire document lays out many of the different thematic areas that the Office of the High Commissioner for Human Rights staff has laid out. And all of the recommendations that were made in the previous cycle have been organized by these different themes. And so what we need to do is to look at what recommendations were made in the previous cycle under the particular theme, and we are going to note whether or not these recommendations were accepted or not, whether they have been not implemented, partially implemented, or fully implemented. And from there, we recap what has happened in the previous cycle. We've recapped what has happened since the government has made its commitment or non-commitment to undertaking particular areas. And I do want to point out that while extrajudicial, summary, or arbitrary executions may sound like a death penalty issue, you'll notice that it was not on that common issues page a few slides ago. And that is because extrajudicial, summary, and arbitrary executions do not fall under death penalty work. And I want to reiterate that. You will come across a lot of information about extrajudicial or summary executions in your research and in your I just want you to remember that they are not the focus of a death penalty report. It's completely separate. The death penalty is a punishment that is applied after a judicial process, whereas extrajudicial and summary executions are not. They are outside of the judicial process. So you may find information about both extrajudicial and death penalty information, but we're only interested in the death penalty. The other pieces of information that you're going to need when it comes to writing your recommendations can be found on the United Nations Human Rights Council website. And I will navigate with you in just a moment to this website. But one of the things that you're going to be looking for is you're going to be going to the page for the country that you are going to be researching. So I know that there are some people here who are going to be writing on Malaysia. So for you, you're getting a little bit of a preview as to what kinds of information you're going to be looking for. But you're going to go to the country's page. You're going to go under the third cycle, and then, which is the previous cycle. We're in the fourth cycle right now. And you're going to go to the matrix of recommendations. There should always be an English version available. And so what you'll do is you'll click on that, and it's going to open something that looks like this. And so when I said before that all of the recommendations that were made in the previous cycle have been organized by theme. This is what I mean. When you look at the matrix, you will see the theme here, theme D23 death penalty, and then the recommendations that were made in the previous cycle. It will tell you which country made the recommendations. The Republic of Moldova made this one, Malaysia, Albania made this one, Portugal made this one, Romania made this one. And it'll tell you whether it was supported or noted. And I do want to point out that when it comes to looking at the matrix, you will see all of the recommendations and all of the themes that are supported first, and then it will start over with the themes for all of the ones that are noted. So you'll see here it says supported, 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 supported. If you scroll further down into the matrix, you will see other recommendations that were made under the death penalty, but that were noted. So when you come across a theme, just remember that there is another version of that theme, oftentimes later on, with the noted recommendations. And again, this is important because this provides the structure and the organization for the stakeholder report that you're actually going to be writing. Another piece of information that you're going to need, and this is from that same page on the website as before, it's just scrolled a little bit further down, is the outcome of the review. And you will look for the report of the working group and the addenda. And so this is just, the report of the working group is a summary of what happened in the interactive dialogue in the previous cycle. So it provides a lot of information about what the country talked about, its own human rights record, as well as issues that other countries raised. What we are most interested in are the recommendations that were made by the countries. And you'll find that usually 1/3 or halfway through the report of the working group. And the addendum often explains whether or not the country has accepted the recommendation or noted the recommendation. This information is helpful, but it's also oftentimes captured in the matrix. And then this is an example of what a stakeholder report looks like when a pro bono team like yours has done the research, has looked at all of these websites, and then actually starts writing. This is about Bangladesh. And so you'll see the team wrote, in the third cycle UPR, member states made several recommendations related to Bangladesh's use of the death penalty. And then an end note. And Katya will be talking about writing the stakeholder report, and you'll note that end notes are the only kind of reference system that we can use for stakeholder reports. But this third end note here would then list those recommendations that were made and the countries that made them, so that we can explain to the Office of the High Commissioner for Refugees staff, we know which recommendations were actually made. Bangladesh noted all of these recommendations, so we know that they did not accept these recommendations, including recommendations to abolish the death penalty, establish a moratorium on executions, and reduce the number of crimes to which the death penalty applies. So this is just a brief summary of what those recommendations are. To date, Bangladesh has not implemented any of these recommendations. So let's say Bangladesh had accepted some of those recommendations. We would still want to know whether or not they've implemented them, because the country can accept the recommendations and they are then legally obliged to follow through on those recommendations, but they don't always do so. So it's important to note whether or not they've actually made progress. So that's where we would have maybe a partially implemented instead of a not implemented. And so I'm going to just briefly stop sharing the PowerPoint to show you the website of the Human Rights Office. Or, sorry, the Human Rights Council. Okay. So if you are at this page, the home page for the OHCHR, you will go to Instruments and Mechanisms, and then you will go to Universal Periodic Review. And then you will go to Documentation by Country. and then you will choose the country that you're interested in, so Malaysia. So, and then we're on that page that I was showing you beforehand. So you would want the matrix of recommendations here, and you would want the report of the working group here, and the addendum here. Okay. So with that, let's resume the PowerPoint, and I will hand it off to Katya.
Thank you, Nathan.
1 second. There you go.
Great, thank you. I'm seeing the whole screen, including the notes. I mean, that's fine, but. Okay, thank you. Can you see the hexagons in your image?
I'm not seeing them. Let's see if we advance once more.
Oh, I got it. Okay.
Okay, it looks
Yeah,
like
you can just click, you can click through and show all of them. I think that'll be easier. So first, I'll talk a little bit about the format of the report. As Nathan shared earlier, there is a template through which we structure this report, and the report is structured around the themes. The report is written in Microsoft Word, and I think it's important to keep, we have a template that we send, so I think it's important to keep it in Microsoft Word so that the template remains intact. You can send each other versions or work on OneDrive or whatever works for you, but keep the template and the format intact. Secondly, we'll have a cover page, which includes, it's not part of the word count, and it includes a description of the advocates, a description of our partner organizations, logos, and kind of the subject and all of that. The cover page will actually be completed by an intern who will be able to give you some research as well. So in the next week, look out for an email from an intern about that. That will have some of the key documents that you need as well, and the cover page. But I recommend, as Nathan showed us how to find those key documents, find those key documents that you can get started on the work yourself. The limit on these reports is going to be for a joint report because we're writing all of them in conjunction with our partner, the World Coalition Against the Death Penalty. We might also have other partners sign on. This UPR process, it's good to have reports that are on the same theme instead of having multiple organizations who all work on the death penalty write a bunch of death penalty reports. It's better to combine them into one report with all of the input. So we may also have other partners signing on, and you may be able to work with them to draft the report. So our page limit is, or our word limit is thankfully 5,000 and not 2,000, 5,630. If we're working with a partner, such as the World Coalition Against the Death Penalty, who has written a report on this country and the death penalty or conditions of detention or anything related to death penalty issues, and we reference that report often in our report, we can include that as an annex. So if there's information that has a lot of detail from a past report that we haven't included, we don't want to include in our word count, we can include that as an annex. This can also be data about people who are on death row or anything that we need to reference. Otherwise, we can just cite it. We don't need to include annexes if we don't need to. And as part of this format, all paragraphs are numbered. So retain that kind of in the template. And that's how a lot of UN bodies like it. They like all the paragraphs to be numbered, and the pages will also be numbered. And lastly, we use endnotes in the report. And the endnotes also do not count towards the word count. And as you're drafting, I would have a big tip, which is to not use IBID or Supra or anything like that. Cite every fact and keep all of your citations full citations instead of shortened, because there will be some moving around. Even after you get a draft in, there might be some moving around, and we really don't want any citations to get lost in that mix or just to be hard to track down. Next slide. So the structure of the report will be around the different thematic areas, and then within each thematic area, we talk about how well they implemented recommendations from the previous cycle. Maybe there were regressive actions that were taken since the last UPR, or new developments. There might also be positive actions. We also write like the progress regarding the state's UPR follow-up action plan. So that might be what the things that they said they do, how, did they do them? Did Malaysia establish a moratorium on executions like it accepted in its last UPR cycle? And we also include other developments since the last UPR. So in kind of the substance of the report, these are, I believe, quotes from the guidelines for how NGOs can submit a stakeholder report and what should be included in it. And that includes credible and reliable information on the human rights situation in the state under review. We want a lot of this to be our perspective as a stakeholder, and to use as much like firsthand information as possible in conjunction with our partners and other reliable news sources that do secondary sources, but the majority should be straightforward from people who work on the death penalty and fewer secondary sources. Yeah, I should also highlight the main human rights issues of concern in that country. So in this case, we're highlighting the ways in which the retention of the death penalty has human rights consequences, and the way that it violates people's human rights. This can include the detention conditions for people on death row. This can include fair trial issues for people in capital cases, or if there's this problem with the administration of justice in that country as a whole, that also impacts people who are in death penalty cases. So we can include that information. And as Nathan said, as talked about in the earlier when we talked about death penalty issues. And we also cover the period since the last review, which is 4.5 years. So that's at least a pretty straightforward timeline. We also don't use abusive language. Sometimes states will reject or like oppose reports that call the government a regime or something like that. So we just use like state party, and we use abusive or otherwise like sensationalized language throughout the entirety of the report. So we also want to avoid language like people suffering on death row or things like that. We want to avoid calling people inmates rather than just people who are in detention, or saying the prisoners rather than talking about people who are in detention or individuals on death row. We want to use language that highlights humanity rather than saying, just saying prisoners or something like that. Yeah, and then as I said, joint submissions are encouraged. So we're happy to submit with our partners, and we might have other organizations sign on that focus on the death penalty in the regions where all of these reports are, where all these countries are. So as I said before, for the writing and the content of the report, prioritize first-hand information, kind of what is our analysis of what are the human rights violations happening that relate to the death penalty. Include secondhand information only if necessary. You can also use news sources that are reliable, and really try to find, the penal code / criminal code. There might be other laws that authorize the death penalty. There might be laws that are like part of the military law, like the military punishments. Try to cite the law itself. And if you can't find an English translation, reach into the language skills of your team or otherwise reach out. But find the kind of the firsthand information about what it's like there, and then also the laws themselves. Also offer SMART recommendations. That is an acronym we use to describe how our recommendations should be formatted, because at the end of our report, we include recommendations for the next cycle. And we use this report, as Jennifer talked about, for lobbying. And we tell other delegates, please give these recommendations to the state under review. So we end the report with our recommendations, and Veronica will talk about that later. And our recommendations will be linked to the themes as well. And the structure of the report is formatted around the recommendations from the last cycle as they fit into the themes like death penalty, D43 or whatever it is. And yeah, avoid a list of, all of the international law, all of the treaties that the state has signed on to or hasn't signed on to. We're focusing on the UPR. So do frame each issue within the context of kind of the thematic title that it's under, and use your recommendations to frame your arguments and organize your report. So we kind of frame it as, okay, what did the government say about this? Here's the government's position. Here's also the provisions provided in the law. And then here's what's really going on. So a state might say, this is, we say we have the right to life enshrined in the Constitution unless otherwise taken away through a judicial process. And then you could talk about, well, the judicial process doesn't limit death penalty to the most serious crimes or something like that, according to the issues that Nathan shared earlier. Yeah, use examples and stories to highlight problems, including gaps in the law and other problems going on. Yeah, and also avoid a really lengthy procedural history talking about all of the recommendations. You can just say they received this many recommendations to abolish the death penalty and this many to limit it to if people over 18, for example. You don't need to list out every recommendation. We do include those recommendations in the endnotes, but we don't need to make that part of the substance of the report. Yeah, avoid big, lengthy discussions of what a particular right might mean, avoid lengthy legal analysis, avoid the tone of a legal brief, and have SMART, precise recommendations rather than vague ones, which Veronica will talk about later. So here is an example. So as you can see, this is our report on Bangladesh. It says D23 death penalty is the theme that it's under. The status of implementation is there. They didn't accept any recommendations on the death penalty and they didn't implement any. So you can just read this first paragraph. In the third cycle, which was the last cycle, member states made several recommendations related to Bangladesh's use of the death penalty. End note, where we include a citation to the report of the working group and the recommendations. Bangladesh noted all of these recommendations, including recommendations to abolish the death penalty, establish a moratorium on executions, and reduce the number of crimes to which the death penalty applies. You may have had countries in a different theme. So we might also have a theme called conditions of detention. The recommendations might be less straightforward than the death penalty ones. Death penalty ones are usually like abolish the death penalty or limit the death penalty to the most serious crimes or something, which are more specific actions. Conditions of detention might say, like a country might have recommended improved conditions of detention, or regarding administration of justice and fair trial, a country might have said improve the judicial system. So then we can say, oh, maybe the country accepted those recommendations and they did this step to improve the judicial system, but it's still not implemented because they haven't gone far enough. There's still problems on conditions of detention. There's still problems in the judicial system. And I believe that's it. I think we'll pass on to Vero to talk about how we craft our recommendations that we do in our advocacy.
Thank you, Katia. My name is Veronica Cadavid Gonzalez. I'm a program associate also here at the International Justice Program. And I'm going to quickly tell you about the recommendations, its importance, and how we can draft good recommendations. The recommendations is literally the wrap up of the report, and it's a very important part of it because an effective recommendation is the most successful outcome and a reviewing process. Like, we want to have recommendations that ensure the implementation of these issues that we want to bring into the Human Rights Council. It is we use these recommendations when we are doing advocacy on the ground, as we have mentioned before, either virtually or in person. When we are in Geneva, we try to make other states to mirror our recommendations, to take our recommendations for their intervention. So they are very important. First, I'm gonna talk to you a little about general stuff, general tips for recommendations, and then we're gonna talk about the SMART recommendations and what it means and how you operationalize this acronym. So first, we want to make sure that every issue that you mention in the report, every fact or legal analysis, does have a recommendation that addresses the problem. Because if not, it will be just a missing part of the puzzle. You want to have the fact stated and the violation regarding death penalty clear, but then provide a remedy or a way to address this issue. If not, it will be just a missing piece. And so you can kind of check, okay, I wrote this part, then I need to write this recommendation in response. And then you kind of close the circle of it. Nathan, can you give me the next slide, please? Now, other general things, I apologize for that. We want to have a straight in the numbers. That means we have to assure the moment, use the momentum. There is a lot of states that might implementing the same kind of recommendations, so that will encourage the state to also do it. So there is a lot of states, for example, in Africa that were abolishing the death penalty, and we could see how it was a momentum, and now they're doing a lot of recommendations of it. So try to see if this a recommendation is something that other states are implementing, so you can it's a way to compel the state to also implement the recommendation when we are doing the lobbying. An offer that you can refuse is you can provide different kinds of recommendations, but if you are saying to the state, for example, do awareness about the importance of why death penalty it's not a feasible punishment in all cases, or if you say ensure that torture is the evidence that is obtained by torture is not admissible in capital procedures, a country is going to be ashamed to say, yes, I'm going to reject that, I'm going to use torture, and then I'm going to reject this recommendation. It's an offer that they cannot refuse because they will be shamed in this diplomatic sphere to accept that they actually disagree with these kinds of recommendations. While we shouldn't side of the whole reference all these other issues that are presented by the other treaty bodies. If a treaty body already recommended something related to death penalty, you can say, for example, abolish death penalty in all circumstances as it was recommended by by the Human Rights Committee. That gives us a little more straightened. You are not using the whole argument and citing all these other treaty body, but you are enhancing that recommendation and making it stronger. And last, we look incremental change. We want to have and that we're gonna see it with the SMART recommendations, but we want to have make sure that the recommendations that we are providing to the states are actually like making a change on these human rights violations that we are seeing on the ground. And with that, now we're going to the SMART recommendations. SMART recommendations is an acronym that means that they should be specific, measurable, achievable, relevant, and with a time bound. And of course, we're going to explain each of those. First, specific. We want a well-defined action. If you say like, adopt provisions to enhance the rights of all people in detention, that is not a well-defined action. It's not easy to measure, and we want to measure and make sure that they are implementing. But if you say, take steps to provide fair trial and due process in capital cases, is something that you can measure. So you want to make sure it's not very abstract, that then like they can even like say we didn't implement it because it's very abstract, or like provide any information saying that this is how they're implementing it. And also like make sure that it's specific to these human rights violations, that like addresses a particular specific issue. So they can connect the fact with the remedy, the fact with the recommendation. Second, measurable. What I was saying, it can be assessed. Like if you have something that is specific, then you can measure it and say like, okay, these are the legislations that they're implementing, or these are the policies and procedures. And like, then like you can in the next cycle make the state accountable for it. And we want actions, not results. You don't want to say, please end all kinds of unfair trials, because that's not something that is possible, like measurable. It is possible, but it's not measurable. But if you ask for something that is take steps to implement the Nelson Mandela procedures, which is one of the like standards that we use, you can see an action. They implemented those standards. That's something that you can actually review. And that's why you need that these recommendations are measurable. Achievable, like that they have the will, if you like, and that they have like the resources to implement the recommendation, and that includes political will. You need to realize what is the political will that the state have, and then like, of course, aim for recommendations that they are willing to accept, or at least like take steps to implement. It's like human rights doesn't happen in a vacuum. It's progressive realization that we want. So when you are writing the recommendations, trying to assess what will be the most achievable and like a recommendation, and you can say like abolish death penalty, and meanwhile implement moratorium. You are using both. You are looking for political will. You say maybe they don't want to abolish at all, but they will be willing to like just like implement moratorium, which is basically keep it in the law but not using it anymore. So that's something that you can like assess when you're writing it. Relevant. We want it to be connected to the situation of the country. Like when you are reading the context and the background research and doing the research, like try to understand what are like the particular facts that you are presenting in the report, and those are the ones that you want to recommend. Like it doesn't, if for example a country doesn't implement, don't have a lot of cases of evidence by torture, it will be maybe not as like feasible to write that, because like as a recommendation. And we want to again like make progressive realization of rights. You want to advance human rights, see what are like these issues that you're presenting, and trying to advance and create like this, readdress the issue. And time bound. The time bound is like we want 4.5 years. The idea is that actually implement the recommendation is these 4.5 years that they have. And the idea is that the recommendation has like this implicit language that make sure that that they implemented in these 4 years and a half. But it's also good to have some deadlines. For example, saying collect data about the people who are in debt row or the women that are being sentenced to capital debt every year. That's something that has a time bound, but it can be also assessed in 4 years. So that's something that you want to have in mind when writing recommendations. Again, it's a smart recommendation. So you try to make sure that all these recommendations that you write fulfill all these acronyms and say, okay, this is measurable, this is achievable, has a time bound, this is specific, and then you can do the checklist and make sure that it's a good recommendation. And with that, we have a minute for questions. And
thank you to my colleagues for their parts in this training. As Veronica mentioned, we don't have a ton of time for questions, but I do want to highlight my email address here, nmadsen@advrights.org. If you have questions, don't hesitate to email, and you can email me, or you can email the other email addresses on the screen, but I'm happy to take your questions either now or as you come across them later on. Yes.
I had a quick question about as it was mentioned as abusive language. So using inmate instead of prisoner.
Mm-hmm.
Is there a list that you all have just so in the interest of being careful? Because for instance, I would have just written prisoner, but I didn't want to offend. So
we don't have a list, although that is something that we should probably think about making. But so the abusive language really technically refers to sort of the ways in which we're describing actions happening. We don't want the language to be inflammatory or sensationalizing. And so oftentimes it's talking about the actions that are happening or the steps that states are taking. But the example of not using things like inmate and prisoner, that is more, we just want to be people first. So people who are in detention, people under sentence of death, or individual under sentence of death, individual in detention condition. But when the sort of focus is on the status of a person, such as that they are detained or that they are, on death row, we want it to still, those people to still retain their humanity. And so the people should be first. But I also wouldn't worry about it too much. Everybody's reports are going to be edited and reviewed by staff from the advocates. And so if there is something that is not people first, we will just make that edit. And also, if you come across something you're just not sure how to word it, you can always email me and ask.
Yeah, it's the context of working in this international diplomatic space. But I think if you just think about writing in a neutral manner, and well, like Nathan said, we can scrub out anything. It comes up less with our pro bono teams than with our partners a lot of times.
For example, we did a report on the Philippines not that long ago, and our partner kept referring to a war on drugs. Now, that is a very common thing that they say in the Philippines, but it could potentially be seen as sensationalizing or inflammatory or abusive. So I just changed it to the campaign against illegal drugs. So it's really about sort of not shying away from the human rights violations that are happening, but presenting them in almost like a journalistic tone.
Yeah, very factual as opposed to, more of an advocacy approach. So you wouldn't want to say something like the government's outrageous actions is another example of not using that neutral language.
Any other questions? Okay, well, I want to thank you all for coming to the training today. We really appreciate the work that you will be putting in on these stakeholder reports. And I just want to say that without the help of our pro bono teams, we would not be able to have the kind of impact that the Advocates does have. So thank you so much for all of your work on writing these stakeholder reports, and watch out, as Katya mentioned, for emails coming soon with further information. Right, Katya, I think you can stop recording.
Okay, bye.
All right.